This cadre of humans belongs to a particular gene pool considered dangerous by the phenomenon because they alone can create countermeasures to the control system.
Oggi vi proponiamo un incontro inedito. Per la prima volta assistiamo ad un'intervista approfondita di Jacques Vallée, condotta da Ross Coulthart. In passato Vallée ha spesso evitato dichiarazioni sensazionalistiche, mantenendo un profilo sobrio e prudente. Questa volta però l'approccio garbato ma incalzante di Coulthart lo spinge ad affrontare temi cruciali con maggiore apertura. Jacques Vallée è nato in Francia nel 1939, è un pioniere assoluto dello studio del fenomeno UFO, laureato in matematica alla Sorbona, con un master in astrofisica. Ha dedicato la vita alla ricerca scientifica in ambito UFO, spesso in posizioni chiave e a stretto contatto con ambienti istituzionali e accademici. Oggi ha 86 anni. In questa fotografia lo vediamo accanto a Joseph Allen Hynek, storico consulente scientifico del progetto Blue Book dal 1952 al 1969. Vallée avrà avuto accesso a informazioni sensibili e rilevanti nel corso della sua carriera? Vista l'età avanzata, invitiamo alla pazienza nell'ascolto, ma ricordiamo che Vallée è probabilmente lo studioso più influente del fenomeno UFO-UAP, tanto da aver ispirato ricercatori come Gary Nolan della Stanford University, che ha dichiarato di essere stato personalmente briefato più volte da lui. In questa prima parte dell'intervista affronteremo diversi temi centrali. Parassiti interdimensionali. Da tempo sosteniamo che parte del fenomeno non sia di origine extraterrestre in senso stretto, ma riconducibile ad entità parassitarie provenienti da una realtà o dimensione parallela, anche se molti protagonisti del dibattito utilizzano il termine ET per semplicità. Non tutte le entità sembrano ostili, esistono fazioni differenti e alcune appaiono favorevoli all'umanità. Antichi lignaggi genetici umani. Discuteremo l'ipotesi secondo cui esistono gruppi umani portatori di tratti genetici antichi che suscitano particolare attenzione e timore da parte del fenomeno. UFO come meccanismo di controllo culturale. Si torna a riflettere sull'idea che gli UFO rappresentino un meccanismo di controllo volto a influenzare l'evoluzione culturale e spirituale dell'umanità. Governi ombra. Affronteremo ancora una volta il tema di una possibile struttura para-istituzionale che opera nell'ombra, con finalità proprie e in stretta relazione con il fenomeno UFO-UAP. Men in Black. Ross Coulthart introduce infine il tema dei Men in Black. Cercheremo di chiarire chi sono. Noi li suddividiamo in 3 categorie distinte. Agenti ufficiali incaricati di indagini governative legittime. Agenti deviati che operano per finalità di disinformazione, anche contro il proprio stesso governo. Entità non umane, la cui natura rimane ambigua ma ampiamente documentata in diverse testimonianze.
And one of my favourite quotations that you have in the latest book is one from Colm Kelleher, one of the scientists who worked with you on the BASS project and also the NIDS as well. And he says, quote, "A central working hypothesis is that an ancient parasitic intelligence has been on Earth for thousands of years. A related hypothesis is that there is a small minority of humans endowed with above average discernment. This cadre of humans belongs to a particular gene pool considered dangerous by the phenomenon because they alone can create countermeasures to the control system." What do you think of that analysis by Colm, Jacques?
I think it's the fruit of many discussions that we had as a group. Colm was running most of the day-to-day administration and business and research for BASS, for the duration. And I worked with him and under him in the part that was my bailiwick. Partially hypothetical, but that's what you have to do in science. You make a hypothesis and Now, science doesn't consist in throwing up hypotheses. I mean, that's the first half. The second half is designing research that's going to confirm or shoot down the hypothesis. And until you've done that, you haven't done science. I mean, a hypothesis is a dime a dozen. Okay, you have to have a way of testing it.
So the implications, though, of that, and I noticed this is something that you develop as well in your book, Messages of Deception, that you wrote in the 70s. And
Yes.
you explore the psychic and abduction elements of UAPs, the idea that UAP encounters are a deliberate mechanism to influence human consciousness, culture, and societal evolution, a kind of a control system to shape human beliefs and behavior. And you speculated, and I think you were the first to do this, that this doesn't involve physical ETs, but a non-human intelligence that operates interdimensionally, or if Colm's right, it's, intraterrestrially, using psychic interactions to provoke psychological and cultural shifts. I mean, that's a very different thesis, isn't it? And it's interesting, it struck me as interesting that Colm had come to a very similar conclusion, that the two of you have kind of put to one side the extraterrestrial hypothesis. Let me ask you this way, sir. Why couldn't it be aliens from another planet playing with us and trying to control us on this planet? Why is it more plausible to you that it's an interdimensional or intraterrestrial, if you like, phenomenon?
So when I first decided to apply the tools I knew and the tools I had, which included computers at Paris Observatory and later in Texas and California, I tried to do what you're supposed to do in science, start from the data and begin to look for patterns. That's what you do with an unknown phenomenon. And you want to see if it replicates something that we already know, from something else. And so I did that. And in my first two books, I argued about the extraterrestrial hypothesis, that this was a good approximation of what people were seeing. Then, when I wrote Passport to Magonia, which antagonized people on both sides, the first edition was a complete failure, and then people thought about it and came back, and it was reprinted and reprinted and reprinted, and now people consider it probably the most significant thing that I did.
It's a classic, Jacques. It's a classic. I love your book.
I knew that I was breaking, my choice. I was just breaking everything, because if that phenomenon has influenced us in different guises across the ages, then there are other contradictions that people were kind enough not to pin me down, but one of them, but I had to think of them first, okay? One of them is, how come the vehicle is the same? I mean, if you buy a car today, it's not going to look like a car you bought 10 years ago or 5 years ago, okay? And the guy will tell you in 5 years it's going to look very different again. Okay, so maybe you should lease the car instead of buying it. So that's what we're faced with. But then, that kind of difficulty, when you overcome it in science, it opens up other things. Because the argument, I was reading something this morning from a scientist, again saying, NASA has discovered something that could mean that there is life on this planet next to a star 140 light years away, but anyway, we can't get there. Well, why can't we get there? Well, we can't get there because of Einstein. And, Einstein said you cannot go faster than the speed of light. The people now are saying, I stay in touch with Eric Davis was my master in physics. My physics is astrophysics of years ago, and it still works, but it's not up to date. Okay, Eric is up to date, and Eric says first you have to go do away with time and space as dimensions because there are secondary things. What's important is the quantum foam, and given the quantum foam, there is no reason why you couldn't go faster than the speed of light. It's just an arbitrary limit it's true that the equations work with c, speed of light, as a limit. Okay, so that's good science, but there could be exceptions to that. One of the exceptions was something that we were teaching at Northwestern. Dr. Hynek was teaching it to the kids at Northwestern in the 70s, that there could be another universe 5 minutes ahead of us. And then it takes them 5 minutes to come here at the speed of light and maybe even faster. So we cannot put limits on that. That's one thing that Gary, Dr. Nolan has said very clearly. There will be, revolutions in science in our lifetime. There have been revolutions, and there will be more. And this is one of them. Okay, so let's stop talking about the speed of light as a limit. It's a limit in the mathematics. It's not a limit in physics.
So when you explain in Messengers of Deception what you mean, why you argue for the interdimensional hypothesis, you suggest that what they're doing, what the phenomenon is doing, is it's presenting itself in ways that challenge existing paradigms, scientific materialism or religious dogma. It's inviting us humans to think about ourselves, if you like, ontologically. It's encouraging us to question reality. It's a long-term strategy, you suggest, to guide human evolution. Why? Why would another advanced life form want to guide the reality of a bunch of primitive apes on a rock in this solar system?
Well, you could meet and interview some very good scientists who say we live in a simulation. This is the way they simulate our. So if you play a simulation on the web, there is a control system. I mean, you put yourself inside the control system, or you're not a player. If you're a player, you have to agree to be part of the control system. However, when I first came up with that, I was challenged by people here in France, a very good biologist from the Sorbonne and a couple of other friends who said, Jacques, there are different kinds of control systems. The Nazi death camps were control systems. I spoke to Jacques Bergier, who had been a French spy during the war and had been one of the people locating Peenemünde, the rocket center and so on, and was one of the first French atomists. So he was interested in, whether the Germans could build an atom bomb and so on. He said that in the camp where he was interned, because he was caught as a spy, tortured, and kept in those camps, all of a sudden the firemen from Munich were arrested by the Nazi and brought into the camp for 3 weeks because they had talked about going on strike. And the Nazi didn't, I mean, this was a wrong time to go on strike. So they put them there for 3 weeks, and then they went back, to where they came from, and they were no longer on strike. Okay? So he said, Jacques, you have to realize that even a closed control system can be a teaching center, not necessarily something where you're going to be destroyed or you're going to be burned alive. Some people will be burned alive, but So there are control systems that are like a system of laws or system or a prison. And there are systems that are open. A university is a control system. The rules are not written down anywhere, on whether you get your PhD or not. You have to maneuver, you have to find the right path through the control system. It's not written anywhere. So which one is it? I mean, that's a question. That's a basic question. That's the only question.
I think I know someone who would agree with you about us living in a simulation. I was watching Lex Fridman interviewing Elon Musk, and Elon Musk was asked what would be the first question he would ask the ultimate AI. And he said, what lies outside the simulation? So it's obviously the big question. Are we a simulation?
I would never underestimate Elon Musk. I was, many years ago, I was on a panel with him in Strasbourg about the future of space research. And he was talking about communication on the moon, and he had a scheme for communicating on the moon. The moon doesn't reflect radio waves, so you can't use radio on the moon, so you have to use something else. And he was busy designing it. It was very interesting. But he's very different today than he was then.
Clearly, Jacques, what we do know, and we know this from the Tic Tac incident that I know your team were involved in researching. And one of the stories you tell in your book is an incident involving two United States RC-135 ELINT aircraft who were intercepted by a UFO in the Mediterranean in November 1993. And it's an amazing story. I'd never heard it before, but essentially the unknown craft placed itself in formation on the starboard side of the US plane, close enough so that the crew couldn't even see the whole craft. The edges appeared to scintillate, and the surface was composed of panels over inlaid panels that were rectangular and translucent, with edges that would disappear, dissolve, or go out of focus as one stared at them. They were luminous, like opal, with a hint of violet. And it's interesting because time and time again, and you describe this in your book, there's always these guys who turn up in suits and spoil the party by basically making people sign an NDA. So in this case, they're interviewed by men in civilian suits who turn up in a C-130 from Germany. They make each crew member sign an NDA. All the material they've obtained, all the data they've obtained is taken into custody. Did you ever find out any more about that sighting? And why? Why is there this cover-up? Why do these men in suits turn up to take away the data, just like they did in the 2004 Tic Tac sighting as well? What's going on?
I've raised and run 5 venture funds in California. Venture funds that are dedicated to essentially the first dollar. Not the financial enhancement to a company, but the first dollar. And the CEOs of those companies obviously know of my track record, and they also know that I'm interested in strange things. The reason they create those companies is that they are interested in strange things too. Otherwise we would be working for IBM, in somebody's basement. So when their family sees a UFO, they like to have property on the coast looking over the Pacific and so on, and they see all kinds of things. And this obviously is not reported because it would be controversial. And when you're running, a high technology company in California, you have to be taken seriously by Wall Street and by, you keep thinking about your next round of financing and which bank you're going to go to. So it's not the time to be in the papers, talking about flying saucers. But they trust me enough over the years. They tell me what they've seen because they think somebody should know about that. I mean, the case I mentioned was a man who was in California and now is with one of the, three-letter agencies in Washington. He was coming back from actually watching some maneuvers in Southern California. And there were reports of strange things among the firing, that was going on within the maneuvers. And his question was, this was not reported. I saw it because I was there, and I was there to watch the proceedings and to analyze it. So I had all the information, but it didn't go anywhere. Why wasn't that reported over to Washington? I said, look, you have those clearances. I don't anymore. Why me? I mean, I can't answer that question. But he said, yeah, but you've gone to other countries where the same thing happens. There seems to be, a layer of just fog over the whole thing, that those things are almost accepted as part of, they show up and they go away, and there is no need to report it. And furthermore, if you report it, you could be in trouble, from your superior officers. So he gave me another example. This was after we had left our telephones, with the waiters and so on, and we were sitting in a corner of the restaurant. Another example where a ship had encountered an American vessel, Navy vessel, had encountered something. This was not the Nimitz, and had been seen by everybody. Recordings had been taken, and some guys came on the plane, landed on the carrier, went to see the commander of that fleet, and confiscated all the data, got back on their flight. He said, that's not unusual. What's unusual is that I saw the paper, nothing was signed. There was no name. That's a violation.
Why?
It's a violation of security rules. That's
why are they doing that?
This is what Congress should be looking at. It's a violation of military security rules. Okay? The paper was not signed. Nobody knows who these guys were. Presumably the commander was given something that authorized this, but this overrides everything else. This was not part of NIDS. This was not part of anything else. This was just a personal conversation with someone who trusts me. This is unusual information that tends to wash up, gets picked up, but it means that there is another, as they say, in some science fiction movies, there is another machine somewhere.
The Men in Black.
Maybe, although I have trouble taking the Men in Black very seriously. A witness in Texas, something had fallen from the sky, probably some piece of some Soyuz or something, and they came to his home, a black officer who had been in Vietnam, and he said, well, this obviously came from God, so I'm not going to give it to you because God dumped it in my garden. If he had wanted you to have it, he would have dumped it at the White House lawn, and he kept it. So the Men in Black were defeated in that particular case.
Approfondiamo l'argomento anche grazie ad alcune testimonianze autorevoli, da James Lakasky a Travis Taylor, l'uomo con 6 lauree e alcuni master.
Bidirectional mimicry hypothesis emerged from but sort of several different investigations that we were doing. And the number one was an attempt to interview and gain oral history from the so-called Men in Black, which is the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, which is the arm of the Air Force, United States Air Force, that is dedicated to counterintelligence and to, creating deception about programs to hide the advanced technology programs that are under the wing of the United States Air Force. So
Right.
we were very fortunate to be able to have a long conversation with the retired head of the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, a guy called Colonel Barry Hennessy.
Your reaction to it was equally as genuine, trying to explain that tightrope. And in that explanation, you had brought up Men in Black, and that kind of piqued my interest a little bit, that you and Jay were using that phrase together. Can you explain that a little bit on what you meant by Men in Black? But what do you mean by that? Is that like an adversary spying on you? Is that another government agency spying on you? What did you mean by Men in Black?
Yeah, so what I meant by the Men in Black specifically is there's so much conspiracy theory stuff out there about this secret shadow government organization and these Men in Black suits coming up and threatening people. They can't ever say anything and they're going to kill them or whatever and all that stuff. And so Jay and I were like, we hope they come to the door because we want to know who these people are because they're operating outside of constitutional authority. And if they do, then that's why we had FBI on call. And Jay was a senior leader in the Navy, and he had, Navy NCIS guys on call that, if something happened, we could put law enforcement into play. And we were hoping that if there was this or I'm not saying we never found the Men in Black. Let me clarify that right now.
Gotcha.
But if they were there, we were hoping they would show up and we'd see what was going on. But I'm not saying they're not there. I'm just saying that we never found them, right? I mean, I don't know anything more than anybody else about that, really, except that from our interaction within the task force, we never saw them.
Quando parla di Jay si riferisce ovviamente a Jay Stratton, l'ammiraglio a 2 stelle a cui abbiamo dedicato ovviamente il primo episodio del canale, il capo di tutti i programmi di ricerca UFO. Quindi non li hanno mai visti, ma intanto erano d'accordo con l'FBI e l'NCIS ed erano pronti a chiamarli entrambi ed entrambi pronti ad intervenire. Passiamo adesso a James Lakasky, il numero 1 dell'OSAP. Questa clip specifica l'abbiamo tenuta da parte da 2 anni proprio in attesa di fare un episodio sull'argomento.
Well, I got something to really reference, and it'll be another little bombshell of mine. What is the purpose of the Men in Black? We have encountered the Men in Black, the legitimate ones.
You have.
I didn't say me, but the answer is yes.
Who are you talking about? What do you mean the legitimate Men in
There
Black?
are people
What is this
who
include?
are gaming knowledge of the Men in Black. But what is the purpose of the Men in Black? Is it to draw attention away from the UFO phenomenon, or using reverse psychology, draw attention to it and the paranormal, of course? What is the purpose? It could be, they're polar opposites, the answers. That's always been the Men in Black dissuade. Do they? Knowing human psychology, do they, or do they do exactly the opposite? They draw attention to the phenomenon. And that's what I mean in my answer to you. I wanted to use an example of manipulating cultural variables, that they're drawing attention. Hey, this really exists. Now, you can also go off on the side a little bit, is say, are we in the realm, because I've talked to multiple people about this, are we in the realm of what we would consider demonic influence? Have we crossed into that? That's a cultural variable too. Operating at the same level? We've got to consider all this. That's why I think this is such a wonderful topic, because you've got all these things you still have to consider.
And it's now I'm going to be long gone, and Colin probably will be long gone, and you'll be long gone, and they'll still be exploring all this and not have all the answers. But that's the manipulation from my point of view of, hey, get interested in this stuff. It's real, and don't just jokingly, like the term dino beavers, that Juliet and Colin saw a dino beaver. No one said anything. That's just created to make a joke about our efforts. But this is a real phenomenon, accepted as such, and you'll see that was part of what DIA did. Collect data, collect data, collect data. The intel communities are great at doing that. But that's an answer to your question, and there's so many aspects of cultural manipulation, and I think it's positive manipulation. Using, an old expression, the train has left the station. No, it hasn't. These books are proof of it. No, people can still get on the train. Now, the false men in black, there was an incident, and I'm not going to go into the incident, but Colin is aware of this. There was an incident of a false men in black. And let's assume they were working for some government agency. What they've never known and never has been revealed is the person they were interviewing obtained a gun. He was so afraid of them, he was ready to shoot it out. If they made the wrong move, it would have been a disaster. It would have come back on us in some way, I'm sure, because I was asked in an interview once, what was your greatest fear during OSUP? And it was like, it's tomorrow and the next day, because there was always something that was happening that would come back and we had to fix. But we've never revealed this person was so afraid of the false men in black that he had a gun tucked into his waistband under his sweatshirt.
You don't know who it was?
You can trace back so far, but you can't. If it was a counter intel operation by some organization, then it could have. That was a bad decision on their part. Bad. They shouldn't have pushed this fella to that point where he was ready to resort to violence in defense. And he was in his own home being potentially threatened.
Well, I think there's a long history also of, especially back in the 60s and 70s, I think everybody's aware of this, of the Air Force Office of Special Investigations having people out there trying to dissuade witnesses from talking to the media, threatening them. I think in the 50s and 60s, threats were much more overt than they would be now. But I think there's this multiple arenas of men in black, all of which are sort of mutually supportive in driving paranoia in witnesses and in the field in general. And a lot of these are multiple agendas for different reasons. And some of them are mimicking the real men in black. Some of them are the real men in black. It's I think it's one of these, I would class it as another example of what I call bidirectional mimicry.
Okay, but the real men in black, are we talking about humans or non-human intelligence? So what is the real men in black compared to just government agents being, interrogating people?
I think there's enough evidence in the literature to indicate that the phenomenon may be associated with some cases of what we call men in black.
But what are they?
Well, they're parts of the phenomenon.
Okay. So not just government agents walking around.
Well, there's government agents that are also at the same time in parallel working on, on intimidating witnesses.
I know, but I'm not talking about the government agents. I'm talking about what you're calling the real men in black. So you're like,
I'm saying that they're part of the phenomenon.
Okay.
I think there's enough data in the literature, especially if you go back all the way to the 1950s, to corroborate that statement.
Even in the 1800s, there was a phenomenon like that. If you read John Keel's Trojan Horse, Operation Trojan Horse. There's in the 1800s, there's a version of the Men in Black.